Something doesn't add up with Hudson and Rex Season 9. On paper, it exists. It was filmed. It was completed. It's sitting somewhere in a production vault, fully finished and ready to be broadcast. But in reality, it feels like the show is already gone. Like Season 9 is not a continuation, but a quiet ending nobody officially announced. And the reason behind that feeling goes far deeper than ratings or storytelling decisions. It goes back to one turning point that changed everything fans thought they knew about this series. Because once John Reardon was removed from the equation, the entire identity of Hudson and Rex started to collapse in a way nobody could ignore. And now, even with a completed season in existence, the question fans keep asking is simple: how can something be finished, yet feel completely over? To understand why Season 9 feels like a ghost of what Hudson and Rex used to be, you have to go back to the moment everything started breaking apart, not just on screen, but behind the scenes in a way that fans only slowly began to realize over time. For years, John Reardon wasn't just the lead actor of the show, he was the center of its emotional structure, the foundation everything else was built around. Detective Charlie Hudson wasn't written as an untouchable superhero or a distant procedural figure. He was grounded, warm, and deeply connected to Rex in a way that gave the entire series its identity. That connection wasn't just a creative choice, it was the reason the show worked in the first place. Viewers didn't just watch cases being solved, they followed a bond that felt consistent, familiar, and real across every season. But according to widespread fan discussion and later developments that surrounded the production, everything began to shift in a way that didn't feel natural to the audience. Screen presence changes, narrative focus drifting away from Charlie, and a growing sense that the show was preparing for something it never openly addressed. At the time, many viewers didn't understand what they were noticing. It felt like normal evolution of a long-running series, maybe even creative experimentation. But looking back now, it reads differently. It feels like the early stages of a decision that had already been made away from the cameras. And then came the moment that changed the entire tone of the fandom. Reports and public discussion surrounding John Reardon's absence due to serious health challenges, including treatment and recovery, added a deeply human layer to the situation, one that made everything far more emotional and complicated than a simple casting change. Instead of a clean transition or a carefully managed break, the situation unfolded in a way that left fans confused, divided, and eventually angry. Because when he was ready to return, when recovery had progressed and the possibility of coming back to the role existed again, the direction of the show had already moved forward without him. A replacement was introduced. A new structure was formed. And the world of Hudson and Rex began to shift into something that no longer centered on the character that built its foundation. That is the point where the show stopped feeling like the same universe to many viewers, even if the title remained unchanged. And once that emotional connection was disrupted, everything that followed started to feel less like a continuation and more like an imitation of what once worked. Even loyal fans who tried to stay optimistic began noticing that the chemistry, the rhythm, and the emotional core of the series didn't hit the same way anymore. It wasn't about one actor being replaced, it was about the absence of a presence that had quietly carried the heart of the entire story for years. And that's where the foundation of Season 9's strange existence begins, because once the core identity of a show is removed or altered beyond recognition, even a fully completed season doesn't feel like a true continuation. It feels like something preserved in form, but hollow in spirit. Once the decision was made to move forward without John Reardon as the center of Hudson and Rex, everything around the show began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore, even if no one officially admitted it at the time. The tone shifted first, quietly, almost subtly, as if the series itself was trying to adjust without drawing attention to the fact that something fundamental had been removed. The dynamic that once defined every episode, the balance between Charlie Hudson and Rex, the emotional rhythm that carried scenes even when the plots were simple, started to feel uneven. Viewers didn't always have the language for it in the beginning, but they felt it. Something familiar was missing, and in its place was a structure that looked similar on the surface but didn't carry the same weight underneath. That kind of change doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, episode by episode, until the audience can no longer ignore that the experience is different. And by the time that realization sets in, the show has already moved far beyond the version people originally connected with. Behind the scenes, the situation surrounding casting and production decisions became a defining point that fans would later look back on with frustration and disbelief. Instead of pausing the direction of the series or reshaping it around recovery timelines and real-life circumstances, the production continued forward, filling the gap left by Charlie Hudson's reduced presence with new narrative focus and eventually a full structural replacement. That shift wasn't just about introducing a new character or adjusting storylines, it was about rebuilding the entire emotional center of the show around someone else. And while that is something television often does in long-running series, in this case it landed differently because the audience had already built a deep emotional attachment to the original pairing. The bond between Charlie and Rex wasn't interchangeable to viewers, it was the identity of the show itself. So when that bond was disrupted, no matter how carefully the transition was handled from a production standpoint, the emotional impact on the audience was immediate and long-lasting. As these changes accumulated, the reaction from fans began to split into different stages. At first, there was confusion, a sense of waiting for things to settle back into place. Then came justification, where viewers tried to explain the shifts as creative evolution or necessary expansion of the cast. But eventually, that turned into recognition, the understanding that the show they were watching was no longer the same one they had followed for years. And that realization is where the emotional disconnect truly began. Because once an audience stops believing in the core of a series, everything else starts to feel secondary. Cases, storylines, even character development lose their impact when the foundation that made them meaningful is no longer felt in the same way. This is also where the idea of Season 9 being finished but not felt begins to make sense. On a production level, a completed season suggests continuity, effort, and closure of a creative cycle. But on an emotional level, if the audience has already detached from the core identity of the show, that completion doesn't translate into anticipation or excitement. Instead, it creates distance. Fans don't see a continuation of a story they love, they see the final output of a version of the show they no longer fully recognize. And that gap between production reality and audience perception is exactly what makes Season 9 feel so unusual. It exists, it's real, it was made, but the emotional thread that once tied viewers to it has already been stretched so thin that the result feels more like an endpoint than a continuation. The strange part is that Hudson and Rex didn't collapse in a single moment. It unraveled in pieces, and each piece only became clear after the fact. For viewers at the time, everything still looked like a normal long-running procedural show adjusting to changes the way many series do. Cast rotations, shifting focus between characters, and evolving story structures are not unusual in television, so most of the early signals didn't immediately raise alarm. But when you connect those moments in hindsight, they form a pattern that feels very different from what it looked like in real time. The reduced emotional weight around Charlie Hudson, the gradual repositioning of the story away from his perspective, and the increasing emphasis on other elements of the show all start to feel less like natural evolution and more like preparation for a version of the series where he was no longer central. What makes this even more impactful for fans is the emotional investment that had already been built over years. Hudson and Rex wasn't just a procedural drama that people casually watched and forgot about, it was a comfort series for many viewers. The consistency of the relationship between Charlie and Rex created a sense of stability that audiences returned to repeatedly. That kind of connection is not easily replaced, because it's not based on plot twists or big seasonal events, but on familiarity and trust built over time. When that foundation begins to shift, even slightly, the audience doesn't always immediately reject it, but they do feel the difference. And that difference slowly builds into a sense of distance that becomes impossible to ignore once it reaches a certain point. By the time the introduction of a new lead character structure became more visible, the emotional gap was already established. The show was no longer operating on the same level of attachment it once had with its audience. Even when episodes were still well produced, even when the storytelling remained competent, something essential had changed in how viewers experienced it. It wasn't about the technical quality of the show, it was about emotional continuity. And once that continuity is broken, no amount of production value can fully restore it. That's why Season 9, even before most viewers have fully engaged with it, carries a sense of distance. It arrives in a world where the emotional investment that once powered the series has already weakened.